Hello, everybody. This is the second session of our introduction to narratology. In the first session, we looked at the definition of narratives, and in this session, we'll look at how narratives relate to the self. But I sent you a few documents and also wanted to give you a chance to, if there was anything you wanted to come back to from last week, to ask questions about that, if there's anything or something that occupied your mind since we last met that you wanted to discuss before we go into the new theme? No? Okay, good. Did everybody get a notification email about this? Okay, you did, right? I sent you like excerpts from my text where I had like painted in yellow everything that kind of related to what we had seen last week. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, so this week we have our first series of presentations. And I would suggest we start historically, and also because it was already on the list last week, with Benjamin, if that's okay. With Walter Benjamin and the introductions, yeah, to the points he makes in his text. Okay.
Sure, that's me. Let's see. Bear with me because I haven't actually seen or done a presentation, so who knows, but everyone can see it?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. So, yeah, I'm presenting The Storyteller, which is an essay by Walter Benjamin from 1936. The subtitle is Reflections on the Works of Nikolai Leskov. So, as the name suggests, the focus of the essay is on not so much on story, but on the character of the storyteller. And Benjamin is referring to the storyteller here as someone that like excels in their capacity to tell stories, not just, you know, the storytelling that we all might do. So someone that personifies that capacity for Benjamin is this writer, Nikolai Leskov. And one of the qualities of Leskov that he finds notable is that his tracks are frequently evident in his narratives. So there's this idea that the experience that someone has informs the way that they tell stories. So both the nature and the quality of the stories they tell, the stories that people tell are informed by the experiences that people have. And so the essay, he kind of sets it up as this lament about the state of storytelling. And he claims that this decline in storytelling is linked to the fact that experience has fallen in value. So one reason he gives is, I guess, like the insurmountability of certain events of 19th century, specifically World War I, the idea that people are coming back from the battlefield less capable of actually communicating. And this is like an ongoing thing that he keeps referring to, the importance of telling when it comes to stories, the idea that stories should be passed from mouth to mouth, and that the best stories are the ones that are closest to speech, or like the closest to how they're told. But the more important factor is this proliferation of information. So he says that if the art of storytelling has become rare, the dissemination of information has had a decisive share in this state of affairs. He's specifically talking about the press and you know, the daily newspaper as being things that have this corrosive effect on storytelling and consequently on wisdom. And clearly this is, given that he's writing in 1936, seems not quite the right word, but it's something like that because, you know, obviously since then, the proliferation of information has grown almost exponentially. So this understanding he had of information having a let's say, a pernicious effect is clearly all the more important today. So yeah, what exactly is wrong with information? He sets up this dichotomy between info and wisdom, and he says that while stories are inclined to borrow from the miraculous, it's indispensable for information to sound plausible. So there's this thing about verifiability versus openness. And that's obviously comes to something we were talking about last week. So yeah, I like this quote here of, you know, if information easily expends itself, whereas a story doesn't, and it can be understood in a variety of different ways. It has a certain ambiguity that allows it to, he makes the analogy to like a seed buried in a pyramid that maintains its capacity for germination, you know, hundreds of years after it's been locked away or something. So yeah, this idea of indeterminacy, and coming back to the figure of Leskov. So Benjamin says that in the writing of Leskov, it's left up to the reader to interpret things the way he understands them, and thus narrative achieves an amplitude that information lacks. So as you brought up last week, Klaus, this idea of reader response theory, and the fact that if the reader can become a co-conspirator, if there's space in the text that they might be able to interpret it, then they can become closer to that text. So that relates to, I can't remember which of the readings, but maybe the actual mind's possible worlds thing of this idea of the virtual text. So the importance of a reader having a role in stories told to them. So just some other ideas about indeterminacy. He sets up, he talks a lot about the novel in relation to the story. So effectively saying that the novel is everything that a good story is not. And he says, and comparing the two, he says the first is dedicated to one hero, one odyssey, one battle, whereas the second to many diffuse occurrences. So another thing there about the ambiguous nature of stories, or good stories, is the idea of finality. The notion that any good story, you could ask of any good story how it might continue. So not being too overdetermined. Similarly, in the case of the protagonist of a story, he talks about how, given that there is no righteous man, the role of who is the good character in a story constantly changes. You know, it can be a drunkard, or it can be, you know, a vagabond, etc. But in every case, it's a guest performance. So there's, yeah, I thought that was an intriguing idea that, yeah, even ambiguity in the, you know, if every story had exactly the same protagonist, I mean, granted a lot do, but yeah, it wouldn't be so interesting or revealing, let's say. So then there's this question of the function of storytelling, and he claims that every real story contains something useful. So the idea being that a storyteller is a person that gives the readers counsel, certain utility. And this he links to the idea of like the idea that a storyteller is tends towards practicality. The idea of a storyteller as a craftsman, even. So yeah, craftsman, someone with counsel. And that's effectively what I've got here. The last slide was just a few other things I found interesting, but didn't really have a place for. So this idea on the left about boredom, the fact that modern man no longer looks at what cannot be abbreviated. And I like this idea he gives of good stories being one in which there's a slow piling up of transparent layers, which, yeah, I like that idea of this kind of textured, layered quality to good stories. I had an interesting thing about memory as well, but I don't really have much to say on that. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. So thanks.
I'm still curious about the memory, quote you had as you had brought it up. Can you read it? So just we know what you.
Sure. I'll read it out. I'll read it out. So, it has seldom been realized that the listener's naive relationship to the storyteller is controlled by his interest in retaining what he has told. The cardinal point for the unaffected listener is to assure himself of the possibility of reproducing story. Memory is the epic faculty par excellence. So I guess just the only thing to say to that is it's kind of a continuation of something I mentioned previously, which was he actually mentions multiple times this idea of stories passing from mouth to mouth, the importance of oral tradition. Something I didn't mention was he talks about like two, let's say, archetypical versions of the storyteller, one being the farmer who tells the honest stories from home, and another being like the seaman who collects these stories from afar. And it doesn't matter whether the storyteller is telling stories from their own experience or from experiences that they've gained through meeting other, having heard other stories. But yeah, so it links back to that, this idea that reproducibility of stories and stories moving from mouth to mouth. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for this concise and interesting presentation. Before we talk all about it, Aladdin, you kind of prepared the text as well. Maybe.
Yeah, I did. I didn't exactly know what an answer was, but I guess I can just talk about 2 points that retained my attention in the text. It was also maybe the first historical fact that actually this essay was published at the same time as Benjamin published his really famous essay called The Work of Art at the
at the time of mechanical
reproduction. And I guess we can clearly saw an influence between those two texts, and especially in how we are losing the art of storytelling, because he said that he started with the first, we talk about that the First World War, like when the process began, but that actually it's probably way before, and he talked about novel and then the printing, and I guess that involved the printing process, and then I guess that the loss of storytelling could be related to the rise of industrial technology, basically, and how like printing, and then after information later on, we actually kind of finished the job of the novel itself.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Sorry, I'm just reading my notes. Yeah, and then the second point was something I wanted maybe to discuss a bit related to last time, and more to the definition of narrative within the field of narratology, which I would like to try to challenge by questioning the question of how, because narratology does not allow non-human to have the right to have narrative, basically, as we said last time, that it was human-like agent. And it's more like a really little speculation about what information could be, and maybe that information is actually a narrative, but not made for us, not made for human, but like more narrative from machine to machine, because yeah, I mean, also in the text of Roland Barthes, he said that in linguistic communication, I and you are presupposed by each other. So similarly, a narrative cannot take place without a narrator and a listener. And then if we imagine that information is actually narrative that are not, that the destination is not humans, then it's why we cannot take them into account as narrative, and they only exist for other agents, basically, than us. And yeah, maybe we can think about also the text you were writing, Klaus, and the idea of, yeah, as painting, as we know that painting can be a narrative, then we can extend that to other meaning of expression in art as dance, and then if a dance could be a narrative, which is, I guess, quite obvious, especially like regarding that we now have a background in anthropology, and we can see that many cultures have used dance as a way of telling stories. And then if dance is a narrative, and then if we just go a little bit of like, yeah, any type of natural documentary of like about the dance of birds or the dance of bees, for example, then how could we provide this to be a narrative, but just a narrative that is not for us?
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's cool. Basically my answer. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Any comments right now on the two presentations already, or on this idea that Aladdin just ventured about non-human narratives, or narratives that would be circulating between machines, information being potentially a form of narrative?
I really like that idea to a certain extent, exactly that idea, because I'm very grainy, apologies. Because like, if you look at it from a more computer science kind of perspective, then information is already a kind of narrative, because you have data before you have information. So like, you have data that needs to be made into information, and that means that it's, to some extent, like, it has had to be mapped, categorized, so literally informed. That's kind of how it's often put, that data needs to be informed in order to become information. So you could kind of almost look at it as kind of like Aristotelian kind of thing, where it literally becomes a form, in a sense, which I think is kind of fascinating. I think just and I really like the idea. I mean, you can see with some of the like theoretical and especially like aesthetic writing on like machine learning, for example, that there definitely is a lot of claims that, for example, like neural networks kind of like proceed along these like causal, self-reflective paths, where you could kind of talk about potentially maybe narrative, or narrative selves even potentially. But I think the danger there is that, especially when it comes to technologies, is that then to kind of like fall into like these flat ontologies, where you kind of then like, and I'm not saying that you do, but I think that's a danger when you follow that path, because then it's very quick that you don't, for example, hold humans accountable for some of the results that machines produce when they tell their stories, basically. So like, maybe to take it to that level. And so I think that it's kind of like, for them to have the capacity for storytelling, like, we will have had to already tell that story, kind of. Do you know what I mean? Like, so we can't have the one without the other. So they can't have their own stories, because we're talking about their stories, kind of like in that sense. Maybe, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, personally, I mean, I'm all open to extending the notion, maybe not of storytelling so easily, because I'm a bit afraid that, like, Shlomit Riemann Cannon says in the text, if everything is a narrative, nothing is. Kind of idea that, like, if we make the boundaries too blurry, then we lose actually the essence of saying that something is a narrative. That's what worries me a little bit in these kind of inflationary uses of narrative. but I would definitely think that if there's like causal connections that are communicated, there is some degree of narrativity. And also, I think what we could keep maybe as a basic criterion is like our actions or events conveyed. And if something or some animal conveys actions or events, as opposed to just a place, right? If like, let's think of the bees again. If their dance conveys just a place of where they find flowers to make honey, basically, then I would feel a bit worried to call it already a narrative. But when, for example, birds make a certain noise to say that a hunter animal or even a human hunter entered the forest, that's at least an action, right? An action or an event. So they would be representing an action or an event, and then to a certain degree, they would be entering into a communicative act that would be close to narrative, that would have some degree of narrativity at least, and according to some theorists like Gérard Genette. And of course, I mean, one thing is of course how you build theories and then what you believe, and obviously one way to build a theory would be to say Gérard Genette defines narrative as the representation of an action or event. In some birds species, we see them representing actions, namely a hunter animal coming into the forest, therefore it's narrative, right? So that's of course a way you can take. You can always take like a big reference, embrace their concept of narrative, but of course Genette's concept of narrative is also contested, and it's not a strong concept of narrative, it's rather a weak one, whereas you referred to my text where I tried to kind of have a like very high level to make narrative this kind of difficult thing to achieve, because then I felt it would be more powerful to be able to show, even when you have a very narrow concept of narrative that makes it very difficult for something to be a narrative, when you could then show that maybe a certain dance of an animal is a narrative, then your point would be much stronger than if you from the beginning take a very weak concept of narrative. Or the same thing would be true for machines, right? If you have a very weak concept of narrative with no plot structure and you just say representation of actions, then you would convince a few people that agree with that definition, but everyone else would be like, yeah, but the way they define narrative is too weak. So of course, in the end, machines come out as telling stories, animals come out as telling stories, but that is only when you define narrative so generously. And so in terms of argumentative weight, the harder you make it for something to be a narrative in your theory, the more striking it will be if you're able to show that something narrates anyway, right? But I think it would be easy to say that there is some degree of narrativity in these acts that you evoked of animals, or that there's some degree of narrativity in machines communicating. Because machines, of course, can also communicate events. I mean, certain breakdown, and maybe they can be very complex. I don't know. So, yeah, there's someone.
I wanted to comment on. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So I wanted to comment on something that the last two quotes on the first presentation reminded me of, involving like the diminished experience of the listener, and also in relation to the that retelling of a story, or that hearing a story or the experience of a story always involves interest in retelling the story. Seeing those things as kind of being diminished together, where as a person's experience of a story is diminished, it changes the way in which they're interested in retelling the story. And it just reminded me of this pretty funny night at a hostel in San Diego on Pacific Beach, when I think it might have been 2 days that this was going on. There basically was this guy who would tell jokes, but he would say them so fast without any of like the performance involved, like without the inflection, without the without like the hesitance or like building anticipation in the audience or building curiosity. But you could just tell that he felt like he was really telling the joke, like he was really saying the joke. But it must have been that for him, his experience of the joke and his image of what the joke was didn't involve a full experience. Like maybe he wasn't similar to how Benjamin talks about those coming back from war, traumatized, unable to fully experience, maybe, you know, he's not able to laugh at jokes. Then in his retelling of jokes, he's not actually telling them in a way that's going to produce laughter, because he didn't experience them that way in the first place. And it was just kind of funny. And but I think also kind of hits on a precise part of what Benjamin's talking about there.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, how much do you have to have understood in order to retell it, kind of thing, right? Or like,
how much do you have to have experienced, and you know, how vulnerable are your sensibilities? If he's just saying the words in the right order, is that telling the joke? Is that the narrative? Is that representing the story? Or does he have to create, from a broader view, the circumstance that the effects that the story is supposed to create or recreate in the audience too? And for him, that wasn't part of like his resolution. In other words, like it wasn't part of what the story was or what the narrative was. So for him, just saying the words in the right order constituted the story or constituted the joke. But we might take another view that in order to tell the joke, you have to recreate some of the effects that the joke is supposed to create, even if those effects are going to be different, and even if that joke is going to evolve over time. There's just a certain dimension of participation that joke teller wasn't present to at all. So he was just saying the words in the right order, and for him that was enough. And I just wonder if that's part of what's going on with the diminishing of experience, and the in relation to stories always being represented in light of the interest in retelling the story. Anyhow.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, it reminds me of an artwork by Gary Hill, where he has a little girl read Wittgenstein's remarks on colors, and the little girl has a really hard time reading it because like there's some words and she's not a good reader yet. She's like maybe 7 or so. And actually then you like realize that she doesn't understand, and you're constantly struggling with understanding something that the performer themselves doesn't understand. And even though she's reading the remarks on colors, when you know Wittgenstein, you know that he was very interested in what it means to learn something. And when can you say that someone understands something? And I found this a really very simple and very powerful artistic treatment of this kind of problem. So this question of like, how is it if someone retells a story they don't understand, and what do they get wrong, and what makes it hard for us to understand when they retell it in that way? Seems really an interesting topic for exploration. Even though, of course, in Benjamin, I think you're kind of like developing on this idea of the retelling more than like interpreting, right? The ideas in Benjamin, because I think he assumes he's more talking about people who actually understood what the story, and then they retell it. But what I found interesting on rereading this text now is also how this somehow relates to this whole theme of virality that we now like talk about in sort of social media, and how do things become viral, and he seems to like be evoking some phenomenon like that, where people have the feeling to want to retell. He even talks about that one. So how stories circulate, which is something which we haven't talked about much before, but which is actually a very interesting question. How do stories become like the topic? Why do people want to retell stuff, and in what contexts? And of course, this is also a holy grail for marketing people, to make stories that people want to retell. And there's a book that I maybe evoke at some other point by a guy called Berger, Jonah Berger. It's called Contagious, The Science of Spread or something like that. And he's a marketing professor at the Wharton Business School. And he actually had his students analyze thousands of things that went viral, trying to figure out what the things are that make things viral. And storytelling is like the fact that something is a story contributes to its virality, but then there are other criteria like practical value, like social currency, like the fact that you want to retell something because it makes you seem like you're in the know. Like, do you know what happened? Like, came out yesterday, you know, like you're showing that you're kind of aware, so it makes you look good. And emotion is one thing, like things that have emotions are more shared, but not all emotions. Like people don't share what they find sad as much as what they find, what makes them angry, because angry is kind of a pusher emotion, where sadness is an emotion that makes you like, whoa. So anger or also amazement are things that push people to share. So yeah, so these are like some thoughts that connect to this question of circulation. And then there are studies about what gets dropped when people retell stories, because you can kind of systematically figure that out. And it's very interesting to see that usually anything that's too weird gets dropped. So the stories become more ordinary as they're retold when you do these short retelling experiments. So they become more prototypical. And there are psychological experiments like that. I don't know. I would be surprised if no artist had ever tried to do something like that, to like see how a story transforms when it's retold, and maybe across cultures. I know of one artist that I showed in Fragile Narratives, Estefania Peña-Fiel-Loaiza, who went to India, to a village where they do like that. They have this old craft of storytelling by visuals. And usually they retell old stories from like sort of Indian heritage, but in this case, she told them a story coming from Latin America. Los Palabras Andantes. It's a story about someone like burying books so they don't get burned in a book burning by the ruler. And then she has this family that she has a translator who translates it into their dialect, and then they paint it. And it's kind of this collaborative painting process where like the men do the drawing, the women do the painting, then there's a little girl who's the only one who knows to write, so she writes the text under it and so on. It's like this very nice process, which Estefania Peña-Fiel-Loaiza also films. But what's interesting is how the story from Latin America gets kind of implicitly adapted to the local context. And suddenly like the ruler becomes a king, and the houses look like in India, and the ruler is represented according to Indian convention, and so on and so forth. So all the things that remain kind of ambiguous and open in her verbal story, a lot of these things get fixated, but they get fixated in culturally kind of coded ways without anyone really reflecting on like whether that's the, yeah. So these things about circulation, I think there's really an interesting theme that you brought up. Yeah, definitely. There's something else which in this text I found very striking is Benjamin's. First of all, I mean, when we do narratology, right, we don't make a difference between a storyteller and a novelist. We would think that novelists are storytellers, and Benjamin suddenly makes this ontological difference between storytellers and novelists. Like the novelist wasn't really telling a story, right? Like he was doing something else. So you kind of realize that Benjamin has this emphatic notion of what storytelling is. It's not enough to relate something. It's like there's much more involved in it, or much less, because maybe the novelist does too much, right? I mean, maybe you want to say something about that because you commented.
Just only one quick remark, which is just to say that the great irony was that when you look up Nikolai Leskov, he is referred to as a novelist, which is, yeah, I found that quite funny.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course, because they're novelists who then would work like what Benjamin hopes should be done by a storyteller, right? And even the examples he evokes, they mostly people who made written text. I mean, all the examples he gives are people who made written text, but apparently he thinks they stayed faithful to the tradition of which he calls, in German, it's by the way, Erzähler and Erzählung. So it would be actually narrator in like contemporary terminology, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. But so people who remain Erzähler, which are then people who don't provide all these explanations, who don't psychologize, who don't give a definite ending. I mean, there would be, apparently there's a whole host of criteria which makes for a good storyteller in English, or Erzähler, which novelists don't follow. And he seems to be worried about this fixation idea. I mean, another idea which I found amazing, you also quoted about this layering, right? Where he talks about, he quotes, I think, Paul Valéry in this context of how like old craft, like lacquer, like depended on doing the same thing over and over again, and kind of being like nature in that respect. Like when a pearl is formed, you know, it's like a very long natural process. And he quotes Valéry as noticing that early craft is like that people like repeat things, and that now we always want to go fast to the core somehow. And I found like that this is even more true right now. I mean, it's like all the things he evokes in 1936, personally, I have the feeling they have only accelerated. I mean, we want to like have all the science in 20 minutes in a TED talk, you know. We want to read Blinkist instead of reading the books. I myself like kind of censor and send you only excerpts of my text because I find they will be more digestible, and I don't want to like bother you with the full text, and so on and so forth. I mean, we have this whole thing going on about being not wanting to be, also not being bored. That's also like this crazy idea, right? Where he says people are not bored anymore. And in the cities, boredom was lost. Especially when you look at all these people who in the metro, I mean, this crazy thing, you know, that everybody needs to, like, every minute needs to be filled up. And even myself, like, I'm trying to self-educate to allow myself to be bored again, and not like, there's an empty moment, I'm going to check someone's Instagram or read a text or do something. So like, I think our resistance to boredom has gone down enormously. And how he connects this kind of metaphysically with the idea that we don't believe in infinity anymore is also kind of amazing. Like to say, okay, when people don't think that there's something after, then of course they have to use every minute because we only have this one life to live. So it kind of connects back to like a non-religious life as well, where you're like, this life is all I have, so I'm going to cram it with stuff. Yeah, these are all kind of thoughts that.
I think that idea, though, that trying to cram more intensity into a moment can have the opposite effect. And I don't know if it's helpful to go deeper into that.
Wait a minute.
But just the idea that I think probably resonates with some people, that trying to create more intensity in a moment might actually lead to less content overall. Like maybe the climactic mode of a lot of pop music, or like the constant really dramatic feeling of sort of more popular forms of media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Sorry, I couldn't find you on the screen to put you on the forum. Yeah, I mean, recently I did this class in Berlin with a bunch of business school students, 21. And I asked them about like their most impressive aesthetic experience. And it was all about nature, about like swimming, it was all about contemplation, sometimes about sharing, about cooking, about like preparing a meal for someone. So funnily, like, I didn't feel the way they live corresponded to what they considered to be the most valuable aesthetic experiences they had. Yeah. But maybe this leads us a little astray, even though, like, yeah, Benjamin would connect this to kind of this tendency of not being idle anymore, and storytelling was something that could like also be cultivated in idle moments, or like as an accompanying task while you were doing a task which was just very time consuming and otherwise boring. So yeah. Okay. I think there's a lot we could still go into in Benjamin, but also this question of the amplitude. But if you're okay with it, we should move on. I think we have, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I was a bit careless, and we have now 4 discussions and 4 presentations. Is that correct? Could those who have a presentation this class lift their hand? 2. Okay. So that's 2. So that's perfect. So next time we have 3. So that's good. We're still on track in terms of time. Perfect. Are there more comments on Benjamin or these questions? Is there something that related to you particularly in reading the text? I hope those who haven't read it now feel like they really want to read it. If there's anyone who hasn't. Okay, cool. Well then, if there's nothing more for now to discuss on Benjamin, maybe we have a final discussion where we kind of can come back on certain points as well, to certain points. Then I would suggest we move to Jerome Bruner. With Jesse, I'm gonna put your mic on again. Okay, good.
Yes, to the next Benjamin, basically.
Exactly.
No relation, by the way. No, yeah.
There is no relation?
No relation, no, not as
Okay.
far as I know.
Okay.
I don't have a presentation, so basically this is all you're getting. And I'm just going to talk a little about the text and how I kind of received it, and what I think are some really, really interesting aspects of it, which I'm kind of, which I was, to be honest, a little surprised by. Yeah, because my first impression of the text was I was very skeptical, because I know that Bruner is a cognitive psychologist, and I have quite a lot of kind of like reservations about cognitive science specifically, not necessarily cognitive psychology, but definitely cognitive science. So at first, when I read the opening pages, I thought, okay, 2 modes of thought, is that it? That's very reductive kind of way of putting things. That's how I saw it at first. And also the first pages gave me a feeling that it was a very functional or structuralist kind of account, which I in other disciplines or arguments I definitely struggle with. And also this brief shrugging aside of what he calls the paradigmatic mode, and to then talk about the narrative mode seemed to me as if that was kind of like saying, okay, the paradigmatic, we know a lot about this, and this is it's basically just about persuasion with logic, and now we talk about something that's a bit more noble. That was kind of like my my initial impression of it. But I have to say, I then found a lot to a lot of very, very, very fascinating ideas, I have to say. Yeah, I'm just going to go through some of them. So basically, what he calls the 2 modes, and one I already mentioned. The one is the paradigm, which is basically a formal mathematical system of description and explanation, which is on page 12. That's where he defines it. So you can kind of imagine it that is kind of like, he positions it early as an argument. So it's kind of like something that goes through a causal chain or logic of expression. And then says that for this kind of mode, we have a lot of what he calls prosthetic devices on page 13, which I thought at first to be a very kind of like materiality focused concept, but it later turns out it not necessarily is. So he moves pretty quickly to the narrative modes, and he has this definition, which is a couple of pages in on page 17, is that the narrative mode deals with the vicissitudes of intention. And that I thought was a quite neat definition. I had to look it up. So vicissitudes, especially in, as far as I can tell, literary theory, deals with the alternation between opposites. And I thought that was kind of like a nice theme that was also running through the text, in terms of early on he says that narrative has this inherent kind of, I don't know how to say it now, but maybe something like a tension of correlation or something along those lines, where it sets up or constructs, if you think about it in those terms, 2 landscapes, so like 2 topologies basically. So you have a landscape of action, which deals with intention and agency, and you have a language of consciousness, which deals with subjectivity, emotion, and the unknown, which is something that returns to quite a lot. So also here on page 15, he deals with prosthetic devices, just as he mentioned in the paradigmatic mode. And he says this is on page 15. So you could kind of say that for Bruner, narrative in that sense is extensive, so as an extended cognition or something like that. But what I then found, or at least interpreted from the text, is he's strictly not speaking about materiality. So he's not speaking about, like, for example, distributed cognition or anything like that, or extended cognition or embodied cognition as we kind of like understand it now. So what he's rather talking about is something very classic in terms of cognitive theory, so language and symbols. So he goes into this at some length, and it's quite interesting. I'm not going to get into all of it, but basically he's talking about that there are tools which produce this kind of like vicissitude of intention, more or less, and kind of linguistic tools or narrative tools. So one of these, and he's especially interested in this, as he says on page 16, because theorem is quite interesting because there seems to be a limit to narratives. There seem to be certain types of narrative, and there's not like this endless plethora of narratives that like abound, but there are rather some kind of like archetypical narratives, more or less. So yeah, he goes into saying that intention seems to be something that's cognitively very basically human, and goes into some experiments with babies, which is kind of weird, but yeah, so basically that intention, as in kind of like causal relations in time and space, is something that we deal with and something that is at work in narrative. And just as an aside, this is one part that I did struggle with, because I kind of come from, which I kind of, yeah, have to pick a bone with the other text Schechtman about, which I guess we'll come to in a bit, there is intention, but there's also intentionality, and that is something that I kind of like, I will kind of talk about, I guess, in a bit. Right. So, and then he gets to the point, okay, so what makes a story, what makes a narrative? So there's not only causation, and there's not only action interaction, but there's also character. And he doesn't really mean character in the sense of characters or individual agents, but he means more of a mood or an atmosphere, or as I would say it later, like kind of like a space for potentials, to kind of like enter into this intersubjective self-positioning towards a text, which was alluded to by Andrew, I think, already in terms of the virtual text. So to get there, he talks about how does language construct stories. And he talks about okay, we could think about two axes. One is about expression combination, yada, 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 but that doesn't really matter, because that doesn't explain the poetic or the poetics of narrative. It doesn't get to it. So what's really important is what he calls discourse, and he doesn't necessarily mean it in the sense that Foucault does, but he means it more that there's a discourse between reader and a narrative, insofar as that the reader writes his or her own, and he does use his the entire time, which sucks a bit, but there you go. It's been a while. The reader writes his or her own virtual text, which kind of is like a sort of actualization of the vicissitudes in intentions, which is, I think, quite a fascinating and active reading of narrative, rather than kind of like a passive, there's text on the page reading of narrative. So he says discourse has three qualities, or three main features: triggering presuppositions, so kind of like implicit propositions or assumptions that all of us kind of carry, but that are also given in narrative and constructed through narrative. and subjectification. So for example, the emotional qualities of a protagonist, and multiple perspectives. And all three of those work into something that he calls the subjunctivation of reality. And that, I think, is, at least for my reading, is kind of like one of the core concepts in the text. So I'm just going to briefly read a quote from page 26. So the three features of discourse, so the reader actualizing a virtual text, succeed in subjunctivizing reality. And he takes that to mean that subjunctive means the following: designating a mood, the forms of which are employed to denote an action or state as conceived and not as fact, and therefore used to express a wish, command, exhortation, or a contingent, hypothetical, or prospective event. He goes on to say, to be in the subjunctive mode then, is then to be trafficking in human possibilities rather than in settled certainties. An achieved or uptaken narrative speech act then produces a subjunctive world. So I find this quite fascinating and honestly a little bit surprising from a cognitive psychologist, because it's kind of like a very atmospheric kind of reading of narratives as more like a space of potential subjectivity or potential action or events that I think is really quite interesting. And following this definition on page 26, I'm kind of gonna skip now a little bit because I think I'm getting on. So he proposes quite a few tools or techniques or linguistic features that can help to bring about this subjunctivation, there we go. As for example, create gaps in the narrative that then recruits the reader's own presuppositions or those strewn about in the text that then activate this kind of like self-instantiation of some potential storyline or feeling or mood or atmosphere or another. And then when he talks about presuppositions or returns to this on page 28, he goes back to say that the paradigmatic also obviously trades in presuppositions, so that they're actually both modes kind of feed off of each other. So the stories we get to tell kind of make possible about the explanations that we deem logical or like what's the word, like worth pursuing or telling or formalizing in the terms of logic, for example. He then goes into what he talks about as total of modes, which I'm not going to get into, but basically he and his research group did a few experiments in seeing how when people retell a text that they've read, they add transformations to kind of like the language that's used there and the presuppositions and the kind of like linguistic features that happen in the author's own work. And what is fascinating is that very quickly in the retelling, the readers shift from talking about the author says that this and this and this happens to actually talking about the characters as agents doing things, which is quite fascinating. So this is kind of like this, this subjunctivation of like characters that act as agents rather than authors having written like a certain steady linear narrative down, which I think is quite a fascinating notion. And I think I'm going to stop here. There's a couple of other things. And I have to say I'm quite surprised about how much I like the text, to be honest. The only kind of like bone I'd have to pick about it would be that how exactly those two modes work together, and also just the minimum possibility that there might be others is something that he obviously doesn't care about going into. So he kind of just doesn't do it. So that's kind of my take from it.
Thank you for this very intricate and interesting presentation. Thank you. response is, let me check. Kelly, she's still here. Yeah, cool.
I don't have much of a big response to that other than to give an example of a book that I read a number of years ago now. Actually, it's by this author called Junot Diaz, and he has 3 different books that he has written, but he has the same characters who we're just getting to know different sides of each from one book to the next. And I remember getting into this huge debate with somebody on Facebook regarding whether he was writing about himself or whether this was actually a fictional character. Because in the way that he writes it, he sort of switches between making it very personal about himself and then making it be about, but this is just a character that's out there. And when he gives interviews, he's sort of like all over the place as well, which really does create this gap for the reader to be able to try and like piece together what is quote unquote fiction and what might be sort of autobiographical and like what have you. And I thought that was just really interesting. And I kept just thinking about this particular like book as I read this text, because I was like, I don't know, just thinking about like the sort of trying to create the subjunctiveness. It felt like there was something very intentional in what he was doing there, but I wasn't quite clear how to like begin to come to terms with that before reading this. So yeah, that's all I have.
So you would find the concept provided in Bruner useful to kind of better understand what was happening there. Yeah. And I'm not doing much justice in describing the book, but it's basically he's just talking about a family, and he goes into like extended families and like just different things that have happened to different people, and sometimes it's very detailed and sometimes it's not. And in interviews he'll allude to like, yeah, that kind of happened to me, but then no, it's not me. But then it's like and just like, so just the way that this narrative is like running was really kind of interesting, and I'm like, what's real and what's not. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Are there, I mean, it's this question of kind of that you kind of focused in on, Jesse, is it's really interesting about the different, like the perspectivism, this kind of question of perspectives, right? And how narrative kind of trades in different perspectives. There's one famous book about narrative by Käthe Hamburger, where she says that narrative provides something that we never have in real life. We can see inside the head of people. And this idea of like seeing through the eyes of another, being like a power of narrative, particularly. And I don't know, do you think this relates to this question of perspectivism and also maybe subjectivization, or is that like a totally different issue?
Well, what I found interesting is kind of like more the kind of like processual kind of like transformations that he speaks to, which with kind of like my current focus, to me it reads a lot like it reads, even though he probably would never say that, to me it reads a lot like aesthetics, really. Like you have this space of potentiality where events can occur and you can make them your own, and there's this kind of like charge to those events if you kind of fall into the right path of potentiality or trajectory or something. That I find really interesting. I think, again, personally, I would kind of struggle with the point of going into somebody's head, because that to me is kind of like the shortcoming of this text, in terms that it's very much cognitivism, in the sense that there's only the head and there's not the body and the artifact and the surrounding and all those kind of like different layers that make these like spaces of potential that he actually describes really beautifully, but like that he like, and that's not like his fault or he's not wrong. It's just something that he doesn't do. That to my mind, or like from my background, kind of make those spaces possible in the first place, kind of. So that was the one thing that I'm kind of missing from it, because when he speaks of prosthetic devices, he does what cognitivism does, is he speaks about language and representations, as if that's all there is, kind of. So that's kind of like the bit that I'm struggling with. And maybe I don't, in terms of the perspectivism, I don't know, is that something you mean in terms of multiple characters, or as in like multiple possible characters?
I was even thinking just of the fact of multiple characters, more in the Rashomon sense, right? Where you would see the same event from different perspectives, maybe some intentionally mistold, but maybe also just different visions of the same events, kind of thing. Yeah.
I kind of like if I were to kind of like try to make that my own, I guess it's not so much as like living in somebody's head, as it's more like living in somebody's flesh, really, which is kind of like a different thing. So like if you take kind of like the phenomenological stance on it, or like at least one of them, you'd say that the flesh is like, it's not just also the body plus the brain, but it's also kind of like the relations you have to your surroundings, and you kind of get that from characters, or from character as well, I think personally, like if you laid out that way. So I would say that like if you update the cognitive approach that's posed here and kind of like bring more of the distributed cognition or the constructivist kind of like ideas into it, I think that would like basically be the same thing as like from a phenomenological perspective, say it's not the language and the brain, it's the body and the language and the brain and the things, the relations that these make possible with the outside world. And that whole package we get to kind of like approximate when we put ourselves into these subjunctive gaps in there, basically.
Thanks. Are there other comments?
Yeah, I have this is Kid. I have a response. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So first of all, I think just to Jesse, I really actually would say, first of all, thank you. I appreciated your presentation, and just kind of a tongue-in-cheek, so not an attack, but I think it's interesting when first of all, kind of to layer things that, you know, I think as you give your as we give our presentations, but as you give your presentations, obviously it kind of takes on this form of a narrative as well. So it's kind of interesting to kind of think of peeling the onions that way, and setting up, and as you speak about potentiality, it's kind of interesting because my perspective, me as the audience to the narrative that you're giving about this author, and being a non-binary person, it's kind of interesting. And again, this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek. I'm just not in any way am an attack or whatever, but just kind of subjectively that for you to point out that, oh, you know, this author used his throughout, and then switching to his or her as then as the, you know, the better form of that, it's still an erasure of non-binary. So it's kind of, potentiality was interesting because it's like I'm sitting here, I'm listening to your narration of this, of your perception of this text, and thinking, oh, cool, you know, here it comes, here's the good part, and then that kind of failure is again not not an attack, but it's kind of cool because it sets up this, you basically were illustrating your point for me as you went along, right, which is this potentiality. You created this atmosphere where this could have happened and then didn't, and I'm like, okay, well, whatever. But anyway, so that's an interesting aside. But speaking to I really do kind of, I think, felt the same connection to this idea of character atmosphere or setting, right? The fact that the narrator or the narration does more than tell the story or events, but sets up this potentiality or this atmosphere where any number of things could have happened. And I'm going to tell you one thing that did happen, right? To me, that's a very interesting, an interesting phenomenon. And especially, I'll get into this a little bit as I get into my presentation, but the idea that within the narrative space, there is this potentiality for more to have happened, or we're setting up basically a set of circumstances where the events that we're going to recount could have occurred, right? And that there's also more beyond that. And I think an interesting kind of correlation to that in just popular media critique, right? We see this a lot with memes, on Facebook or wherever, where people are very critical of the writers of Game of Thrones, or how the characters of Star Wars, right? It's like this attack on the author as the narrator for having told the wrong version of the story, or having not represented a potential aspect of what could have happened in the same way that the audience would have liked to have heard it, right? So in the end, like, really, there's only one form of the narrative, right? There's only the original true story as created by, in a fictional sense, the author, or in a documentary sense, the actual events that occurred, right? But it's very interesting to kind of see, the rewrites and the fan fiction fixing the original author's concept because they feel that this is the way things actually should have occurred and that the author actually did it wrong. So anyway, that's my take on that. I do appreciate your presentation.
Can I just briefly answer, because there's two things I feel very strongly about that. First of all, I'm sorry for perfectly proving my point that way, I guess. So I am now aware of it. So thank you. And second of all, I think absolutely, and particularly because I'm also like a little bit part of that fandom from the book's perspective more than the show, I guess. So I'm very much aware that there is this intense struggle for the correct narrative, which I think is absolutely fascinating. It is, and that's just my 2 cents, and I'm really aware that I'm talking too much, so I'm not going to do that anymore. But like like people have forgotten that there's supposed to be that gap, kind of like that there's supposed to be that kind of like atmosphere or nuance in it, kind of because we're so obsessed with the immediacy and like truth of the thing that's immediately there that the nuance of the thing changing is kind of like culturally obsolete, basically. So that's just it.
Can I say something? I think that maybe that might be a bit tricky. I understand what you're both saying, but I think it might be a bit of a tricky gap, because the need to want to sort of revise the narrative or perhaps see yourself in the narrative can also be as a result of being erased from the narrative for quite some time. And so I just think that we also need to bring to think about that. There was actually, no, that's all. Thanks. I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I was. Yeah, thanks for these nice comments. Yeah, of course. I mean, just like to react on a more kind of what are this kind of some theoretical possibilities to deal with these questions. I mean, one thing is, of course, that there are narratives where the author gives up a certain degree of his authorship, like in Cortázar's Rayuela or something, where at least the structure of the reading is kind of constitutive of the story. Hopscotch, I think it would be in English, right? Where there are kind of experiments where there's not one way to tell the story, but there are multiple ways to read it, and then yeah, there's no one ordering at least. But of course, the characters kind of stay the same, even though like it might change your perception of the character, whether you see them doing one thing first and then the other and so on. So there are many ways in which just kind of the order in which things happen influences the way you perceive those very things. And then also this idea like that you both felt kind of an appeal of this idea of an atmosphere where things could happen. And I do think that a lot of the current kind of successful stories, at least in series and so on, have to do with people wanting to enter the atmosphere much more than like seeing the tale, actually going back into the world where the tale is being told. I would even say that like in things like Lord of the Rings or in Mad Men, it's not, Mad Men has no story. I mean, there's not even a cliffhanger, but people kind of wanted to dwell in the world of Mad Men, as uncomfortable it might have been in some respects. But so, and there's one way narratology is trying to account for that is with the concept of story worlds. So it not being so much about stories anymore, but about story worlds, which the sort of traditional term brought in by Jeanette is the diegesis or diegesis, but like the sort of English term would be the story world. And one major theorist, I don't have on a reading list, and he's a cognitive narratologist, so Jesse might have negative predispositions, and I do understand those towards him, is David Herman. So David Herman has written a lot about story worlds, and there's also a lot of great work done about story worlds by Mary-Laure Ryan, Marie-Laure like in French, and then Ryan like in English, who thinks a lot about these questions of story worlds. And of course, in a certain sense, she also writes about video game stories, because you kind of, in kind of new video games or some of the more innovative ones, you don't have like one way to go through the game anymore. So of course you kind of explore a world as much as you try to achieve something. You just like walk around and try to figure out what you can do and where you can jump and what you might discover. So this kind of exploratory aspect where the narrative nearly goes to the background is something that traditional narratology didn't like account much for, because they were always like, what's the story, what are the characters, and so on. So that's like since the 90s or 2000s, it's something where you might find, if you're interested in exploring deeper into these kind of things, you might find some relevant stuff. And one last thing which relates to this fan fiction, which I find very interesting, which also is being studied, of course, now by some narratologists, is like, how do you conceptualize that, right? Do you say, actually, well, there is the right story, which is the one that the author wrote, and that's kind of the authoritative story? Or do you go like an anthropologist has done? You say, well, these people become co-authors. I mean, he did it on something else. It was this, I can't remember his name right now. Maybe someone can. Alfred Gell. I don't know if you know Alfred Gell. Alfred Gell, when he wrote about the Rokeby Venus, which was at one point like attacked, slashed with some weapon by a suffragette, because she wanted to liberate another suffragette that had been like, they were advocating for voting for women in England and so on. So she destroyed that. And she said that her attack was like a symbolic attack on this image, like the woman held in prison was being attacked by the state, kind of. And Alfred Gell says, well, she becomes, after Velázquez, who did the painting, she becomes a co-author. So like he kind of gives her authorship of the slashed Rokeby Venus. So rather than saying the Rokeby Venus is a work by Velázquez that has been destroyed by someone, the destroyer becomes a co-author, which is kind of a very radical way to deal with these attempts to revise something, which, as Kelly also pointed out, you might perceive as problematic in the way it stands yeah, and to like integrate that. I think it would be an interesting theoretical move to make also for these alternative narratives, maybe. Are there any replies or other things you wanted to address in relationship to Bruner? If not, I would suggest we move to Alejandra. I don't see any hands or anyone speak, so I think it's actually useful that Alejandra speaks first about I don't know actually, because it's half, but about Strawson, and then we go to the last, to Shechtman, because she kind of tries to sort out, kind of come to a conclusion with these. Is that, what do you guys think? Those who are in charge of these two texts, is that the better order, or do you feel that Shechtman should be treated before? And how about Alejandra? You have no clear stance on that? No. Okay.
It's fine. It's fine with me. I think that's a fine order. So.
Yeah, Alejandra, good. Is that okay with you too? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I will start with Mara Shechtman, the narrative self. She starts with different kind of views for understand the self-narratives. And she works with 3 different parts of big structure of narrative. These parts are the selfhood, the narrative, and the agency. She says that the self are inherently narrative entities, and that one is that our sense of self must be narrative, and the other that the lives of self are narrative in a structure. No, so then she started to put different examples with different theories. And the first one is, well, I have here the text, so that's good. Okay. Yeah. And she started to read McIntyre, and that she says that the agent's primary intentions is that know that it's a place of behavior in the context of intersecting histories, no? And also says that need to be ordered both causally and temporally, and both orderings will make reference of sittings, no? The dimension of a narrative is that it's not just applies of individual intentions, so it has a purpose that requires that narrative explanations include a normative or evaluative dimension, which according to McIntyre applies not just to individual actions, but to our lives as a whole. No, it's like she started to speak like the unity of a human life, and it's the unity of a narrative quest. No, and this is this first theories is also hermeneutical theorist, and yeah, she follows with that. And also comes to with Taylor that he says that the self must be narrative informed, and that's when it comes to forms with in terms of frameworks. That is the background traditions we define the fundamental terms by which we evaluate our life and our world. So that's how it also includes the intelligibility of actions requires that our life be narrative informed. Then he comes with start to make a relation with Taylor and McIntyre that this view of our lives has to quest a narrative to emphasize this continuous between life and literature in a way that McIntyre does not. So the hermeneutical views are not the only views that see self and inherently narrative informed. Well, here started to say that the self is a fiction, but an use of fiction, like the notion of a center of gravity as it occurs as physics. So this was interesting for me because, I forgot that. It started to find Daniel Dennett, that Daniel Dennett says that the self is a fiction like gravity, but it says that, but it is a fiction that has nicely defined what the light and what the behavioral without physics. So the self, he says, has similar ontological status. Self, as he conceives them, are characters in the narrative we humans spin. And also that human brains are narrative generating machines that serve for the protagonists of the narratives they generate. And he started with an example talking about Melville's Moby Dick, no? And with this phrase that is Moby Dick called, so Melville begins Moby Dick, call me Ismael, no? Then I start to put an example with a robot that is that neither the narrative brain nor the brain organism which operates both of which are real things are self-obtained views that are melted to the self-Ismael. We tend to conflate the two because the narrative of our brains spin generally depict the movements of the human being from which they emanate. So this is example. That is the robot. Suppose this machine spits out a novel that begins, call me Gilbert. So, and takes the form of an autobiography of some named Gilbert. Gilbert is the protagonist of this history, but there is no temptation to say that Gilbert, the subject of the autobiography, is actually the clanking computer sitting on the table. So, similarly, our brains are narrative generating machines, but they are not themselves. Brains don't know anything. For this reason, he says it is not a category mistake to start looking around ourselves in the brain. For Dennett, the self is constituted through human narration, just as it is for the hermeneutical theorists, but there are important differences as well. It is more a matter of keeping track of the history of the body in which the narrating brain resides. The brain constitutes a fictional protagonist by telling a history. No? Then it follows with a different theory that it calls the narrative self-constitution view. And this view says that we constitute ourselves as self by understanding our lives and narrative in form of living accordingly. Those do not demand that we explicitly formulate our narratives, also we should be able, for the most part, to articulate them locally when appropriate. But rather than we experience and interpret our present experiences not as isolate moments, but as a part of an ongoing story. So here is kind of different because it started to think that when something's happened, we start to create a narrative with the common things on the view of the life, no? Also emphasize in the agency, it so strongly as a hermeneutical views does, nor does it insist on overall ethical orientation or thematic unity to the life of self. Then comes more in the narrative capacity that is not focused in the history of life. It identifies the self with a character in that history, but rather on the fact that selves employ the kind of logic found in histories when they describe, explain, and choose their own behavior. Kind are found frequently in development and evolutionary psychology. And then she started to talk with Catherine Nelson, and Catherine Nelson works in a more psychology way with the hypothesis. She worked with children, how children start to make narratives when they learn from the adults and the people that has consciousness in their context, no? She says that the new levels of consciousness that emerge in early childhood together with a new sense of self situated in time and in multiple social realities. A new subjective level of conscious awareness with a sense of a specific past and awareness of a possible future, as well as with new insight into consciousness of other people. Now, is that the children enter into language they learn with the help of their caregivers to narrate the events in their life. And she puts as an example, Mommy and I went to visit Daddy at work in a big building. We looked at a window and it was fun. So that's how children learn to do this work themselves. And when they do, they enjoy quality, new kinds of experiences, are able to participate in new forms of social interactions. Yeah, and that's how Nelson focused on the importance of self-conception in the constitution of selfhood and the way in which narrative sense of self is crucial to selfhood. Yeah, well, and then, yeah, because she's trying to make a lot of different theories, and then she came with Bellemans. That Bellemans is the one that has a counter-argument to Dennett, that is the one that was telling the history about the robot that started to think by himself and making a narrative. And Belleman accepts the basic outlines of Dennett's account of the making of the self-true narrative, but believes that if we follow this account to its logical conclusion, we will see that the self that emerged from the narrative activity of the human brain is real and not fictional. And that is the difference, because I think that that Dennett is trying to generate the robot doesn't has information. He only works with the past, that only works with the things that already has happened to him. But Belleman says that we can that the human brain can anticipate things. So he puts an example that when the robot, it's not only generating thought about it's in that's something that already happened. Like, I went into the closet and I was locked into there. The robot also could be generate a thought about I'm going to the closet. And that is the difference between Belleman and Dennett, because it says that the narrative is bigger than the past. You can anticipate, no?
A short question, Alejandra. You prepared Schechtman only, not Strawson, right?
No, I prepare Maya.
Okay.
Schechtman.
Because apparently there was a misunderstanding, and Kit and you both prepared Schechtman, and no one prepared Strawson. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether you would mind if Kit took over the second part. So he'll.
Okay.
So yeah. Okay. Cool. Is that okay with you, Kit? Yeah. So you both get a chance to kind of give part of your take on that text, because I just realized. Okay. Well, thank you for this, and then in the end, probably you can both kind of do the conclusion together, if that's okay. Okay. Cool. Great. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So yeah, I won't go into, I didn't actually have a visual presentation, so that's probably good. And I won't go into too much repetition, hopefully, from what Alejandro already had talked about. I think the high points for me were kind of distinctions between the different views on the self, like the roles of the self as narrative, as narrator, or as kind kind of editor, and or critic, and so the one quote that I did want to kind of pull out that I think was meaningful was, I'll read it kind of verbatim: the creative act in narrative self-constitution is thus neither to produce a tidy and meaningful story out of which I'm sorry, I'm really distracted. Is that Alejandro? Can you maybe?
Yeah.
Thank you. So the creative act in narrative self-constitution is thus neither to produce a tidy and meaningful story out of a whole cloth, nor to take accidents and contingencies and arbitrarily interpret them as meaningful. It is rather to carve out a meaningful life trajectory by appreciating the contingencies, considering how to respond to them meaningfully, and directing life so much as possible in the direction of that meaning. So the again, I think the looking at kind of the whole idea of a life, of a self as a, I think in this case it's approached as potentially a single narrative or an overarching narrative of life, towards the meaning of or towards the building of meaning or intelligibility, and also then as kind of covered in the section on commonalities and differences, the taking that into account with the embeddedness of a self within society and within a living culture and within the norms of a culture or traditions, and the main thing the main thought that kind of came to me, and this actually works really well with in conjunction with the project that I'm working on artistically myself, is the tendency towards and especially within this text, to consider a life as a story with a single or overarching narrative or story arc, with a beginning, middle, and end, as opposed to I think my own view is of life being more of a collection of short stories, and this is somewhat I think in lines with I think Strawson's viewpoint of the self as episodic in nature. But I think there are varying layers of narrative within life that kind of contribute more to that puts the self more in lines with, I think, what you were saying earlier. It's like really a life or a self is more of a transmedia story world, right? It's closer to being the character or the setting, right? The potentiality of being in the self, as opposed to a single overarching narrative. And I think, when we look at, especially now in where we're at with regards to social media and the fact that there will be, you have your Facebook and your Twitter and then you have your more structured environments like dating apps or whatever, where you are setting up a specific bio and a specific kind of slice of yourself and a more curated version of the self narrative towards a specific purpose. And then if you're an artist and you're used to having your artist bio and the narratives that we create around that part of ourselves, which are in some ways again kind of edited or curated versions of ourselves, or even bordering on the fictional, right? And so for me, there's that kind of real time aspect of curation of the self, and also being someone who is kind of transition from male to non-binary, there is kind of this breaking of a timeline, right? This you know, and also one thing I'll say about myself is that I am autistic, and I was, but more, also important to that understanding is that I was diagnosed late in life. So I was in my late 40s or mid 40s before I was ever diagnosed. So this understanding of life as a set of narratives, or self as a set of narratives, is specifically interesting to me, because what happens is when you get this type of diagnosis, right, and you go back through your life experiences. I spent a couple of years where I basically was just fixated on recounting things that have happened to me in my life, understanding that, and kind of like we were talking about earlier, about the ability to tell a story being maybe different based upon your cognitive ability to understand what was going on, right? So going back and looking at these narratives, right, these memories that are kind of condensed versions of, you know, curated versions of the events through a certain filter, which is the lens, the autistic lens that I didn't him with, right? And then going back and looking at those things and saying, okay, what did I not see, you know, or how was my, that specific cognitive bent that I wasn't aware of responsible, and kind of co-creating this narrative that I've stored away about what my life was, and what, you know, how was it actually, what's the perspective that I might have had I not been looking at it through that filter, right? So, so I think from my perspective, moving forward from this text is kind of maybe a more of a focus on not necessarily a single overarching narrative, but as the self as a transmedia story world, or a collection of an actual curated collection of narrative. It's what do we take, what do we choose to keep, what do we choose actively to cut off, what do we lose because we age and our memory starts to go, right? And kind of dealing with kind of this curated sense of a collection of narratives, and really, like I think Jesse pointed out before, kind of this idea of really atmosphere in place. What potentiality do we create, either, or do we create and co-create, right? As an individual with a self, and how how do we then move to communicating that? How do we present that just through our being and doing? And then how might others recount that narrative, right? How might others, when someone talks about me or recounts something about me, then how are they essentially not only recounting that narrative, retelling that narrative, but also co-authoring me, right, as retailers of that narrative. So that, anyway, that's kind of what I had from it.
Thank you. Alejandra, do you want to add something based on your reading right away?
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with Kid, but also I would like to talk about when we tell ourselves our narratives, and in the text was a part with the audience, who is the truly audience. And I think we already saw here with the audience that we are only talking to ourselves or to another person or to a community or between humans or humans, I don't know. And also the difference between literature and the human lives, because I don't know, in the text says that the literature has different forms of narratives with characters and with a context in an aesthetic point of view. But in life, it's not like that. No, in life, not only is in aesthetic form, and not everything has like a beginning and an end, no? So that's when you only have the tools from the past, or the tools from experience in the day by day things that happens, no? So that's the difference in the narratives and in the fiction, and how do you deal with that, no? That's all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have two respondents, I guess, Susie and Jesse. Susie prepared probably. Did you prepare Strawson, or?
So maybe.
You did prepare Strawson?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So maybe you can add some points on the Strawson debate later.
Mm-hmm.
That would be great. Okay. Yeah, you can jump in a little bit on Strawson more in detail. Jesse, how about you? Do you want to give your take, because you were the respondent for Kid initially, right?
Yes. Yeah. And thanks, Kid and Alejandra. I think in general, I really kind of like massively struggled with the text, and now that you kind of like both of you kind of pointed out things that I didn't even see as the reasons why, I think, but it make total sense to me. And it definitely is this kind of like positing of this kind of, that there is something like a grand narrative, and it kind of reminds me of like modernism. And as Kelly pointed out earlier, there's ample reason to see those narratives as kind of like constructed and actually like kind of like ignoring alternative narratives and things like that. So both on the personal as well as the societal, historical, in terms of, and then also in terms of power relations. So I was kind of like struck in the text how partially, well, just how conservative that view is when you explicate how that actually relates to people's lives and not just the stories that people tell, kind of. What I also struggled with, and I think it's a personal thing, but, well, not a personal thing, but like in terms of, I think that a lot of the, when she kind of like, or when the author invokes phenomenology and hermeneutics, I think she invokes very, very particularly narrow views of those two disciplines, at least to my feeling. So I would kind of like, I kind of like don't understand why she uses them, to be honest, in some regards. But what I think, and I think that that was what Alejandra also pointed to in terms of the audience, what I did kind of like find interesting is that here she adds to this notion of Bruner in terms of subjunctivation, not just the various possible or potential characters that we could kind of like put ourselves into as a kind of like narrative trajectory, but also that we ourselves take up various roles in the ways in which we engage with narrative. And I think in that sense, that's something that I think I now realize was kind of missing for me from Bruner, was that there's not just intention, there's intentionality. So that, like, phenomenologically speaking, like in terms that we are directed at things, like there's no pure experience, but there's always an experience of something or as something or whatever. So I do appreciate that that kind of fills in the picture a little bit more, whether those three things that she mentions, which I think is
narrator, character, and critic.
Yeah, exactly. I think thank you. I think that makes like the picture a bit more complete, because then like you can kind of see what, if you frame it in terms of intentionality, you're always directed at something not only to particular ends, but because you're directed in certain ways through whichever circumstance, there's also like a different slice of the world, and with that also an audience, I guess, if you think in terms of telling a story that you have access to, or that is disclosed to you. So I do think on the whole, as I said, I quite struggle with the text, and I found it kind of interesting that when Strawson was discussed in the text, that I found myself kind of almost vehemently agreeing with Strawson. Yes, what's the point of this? There's like, it doesn't, like, there's no meat to it. At least that's what I found at that point. But I do understand that there's a contribution that kind of widens the scope for me quite interesting like theoretical concept of subjunctivation in that sense. So I guess yeah, that's it.
Splendid. Maybe Susie, the Strawson keyword would work really well for you to say a little bit about Strawson. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to recap a little bit what Strawson talks about, he kind of makes this distinction between diachronic and episodic narratives, but he speaks about it almost as if people are either diachronic or episodic. So diachronic meaning that they kind of take this overarching narrative, like view of their life as a whole that is a narrative, whereas the episodic person doesn't necessarily see something that happened in the past to be consistent with who they are now. So they understand that it was like their same body that had that experience, but it was not them as a person now who had that experience in a way. So I mean, I think there are some issues that I have with the text, but there was one thing that it made me think of. I mean, I was sort of thinking in response here, but and this might be taking it a little, might be abstracting his argument a little bit too much, but I was thinking about this idea of the relationship between the diachronic and the episodic in terms of institutional narratives. And so, like, particularly if you think about sort of an art institution and how it defines itself, or how its institutional narratives are defined. There are these two kinds of narrative processes at play, especially in sort of particularly with like a collecting institution, right? So you could think of the diachronic as the way the institution works with its collection, its collecting practices, the way it presents that as this kind of overarching meaning or narrative of what the institution is about, and sort of tells the story of the institution through this collection. Whereas the temporary exhibition schedule or other kinds of programming operate in this kind of episodic manner, where every, however many months, some kind of new experience is presented. So yeah, that for me was a way of sort of thinking about this text and thinking about the relationship between these two ideas. But what else did I want to say about that? Yeah, I also think that, yeah, no, I'll leave it at there for now.
Thank you.
I have a question for just in terms of like using the sort of institution example. I'm wondering whether the sort of like programming that we might see as episodic is not just programming that's enhancing the diachronic narrative of the museum or institution.
Yeah, I think it can operate in both ways. It kind of depends on the institution and what their particular goals are at any given time. But it makes me think of, I can't remember which of Boris Goris's texts, maybe someone remembers, he talks about this idea of, I apologize if I'm going too far away from the text here, but he talks about curatorial practice as kind of being almost dictatorial, in that every new sort of curatorial concept comes along and wipes away everything that came before it, and sort of states that it's the new the new way to think about things. So yeah, in that sense, I think it really depends on the institution and whatever its goals are at a given time. But there is always, I think, this relationship between the diachronic and the episodic. So there's like this kind of back and forth that's happening there. And for me, I think maybe that was kind of what was missing in Strawson's text, was the idea that, or he maybe didn't flesh out enough for me, how those two states can operate simultaneously in a person or in an institution, or however else you want to apply this idea. It was a little bit too essentialist, like you're either diachronistic or you're episodic.
Yeah, and I think that's why I like even asked the question, because it just seemed like even within if I think about myself and sort of like maybe the episodic narratives that I might tell of this particular self, it's still working in tandem with the grand, the other narrative of the self. And I don't see those two things as being like separate. But yeah, in this text, I was like struggling with that as well.
Right.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. We kind of went through the different presentations. Maybe we can now come back to different points in them that we could develop a little bit as we go on. There were several points that I found really, really interesting to go deeper into. This idea in Kids Reading, where he said that you kind of position the self as creator of a story world, which I think is an interesting way to see yourself also as being someone who will create the possibilities of things that can happen around you, that can happen in your space, because the idea of story world is usually that there are story worlds where in highly realistic stories, no dragons can appear, right? And then there's story worlds where suddenly like someone who died can reappear and the dragon can pop up. And in some story worlds there are aliens, in others there aren't. And now if you kind of reapply that to the conception of the self, kind of becomes interesting what kind of story worlds we create and what characters can do in our story world, what they're allowed to do, what kind of characters exist even, right? Like, does our story world include non-binary characters or doesn't it? All these. I think it's kind of an interesting tool, and I'm really a fan of what some of you have been doing while being a bit apologetic about it, which is reapplying the concepts and repurposing the concepts, right? And I kind of like this idea of using text also as toolboxes, as Foucault once said, where you take like something and then you take the tool that was built within one context and you look how it works in another context. I think it's a very valuable contribution, and a lot of things are innovative because they're just transfers of solutions that have worked somewhere else, and you bring them to a new field, and it makes you think this new field in a different way that it hasn't been thought of before. So bringing, for example, this distinction between episodic and diachronic to like how institutions govern their programming, I find interesting, or bring this idea of story worlds, taking it out of the strict context of literary or fictional narratives and bringing it closer to the self. For me, it's quite thought-provoking what that like could mean, and even go further into that in a sense where you could say that the self is a story world, like that it's not like only the world you create around you, but that somehow each person's presence creates a space of possibilities in which certain events can happen and others can't happen, and in which certain characters can exist, can speak, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And if that connects to someone. Jesse, you have a point, yeah. Blind spot of the situatedness. Maybe you can read it yourself, though. Oh, your sound.
Yeah, well, I'm just kind of mindful that we were told in another seminar that the people that talk a lot should kind of hang back. So I'm very much aware that I talk a lot. So I'm sorry. But I do find that, and I think the institution is interesting as an example, but I kind of feel like, and that's something that's, and it is kind of a bugbear of mine, but like that I feel like is missing from the text so far, and whether from Bruner, which I really liked, or Strawson, which I kind of like also think has a lot of good points, is kind of that like whether we're telling the story, that the stories can be diachronic or episodic, which I think is definitely a thing, and also in terms of lived experience, definitely a thing, as Kid kind of like also pointed out. There are not just the stories and the language games that we fabricate with them, but there is kind of like there are actual material situated, like whether we call them realities or not, but let's just call them materialities. So like whether an institution, and I do get the curatorial argument, which I absolutely like would follow that law. There is a sort of argument that's made by the curator that kind of like modifies the space and kind of like proposes a new argument in like spatial relations and things like that. Definitely. So, but it's not only that the curator mediates the space also mediates the curator. So it doesn't matter in a sense if it's like radically episodic and tells something really new, if art is still super elitist, which it definitely is in Germany, in a lot of ways. You know, like nobody goes to the museum that doesn't also go to the opera. Let's say it in broad strokes, maybe. That is still a situated reality of the place. So the kind of like whether you all of a sudden do an exhibition on protest culture or aesthetics, if it's still in an elite place that communicates it with you know Greek columns and not being close to public transport, or not having a wheelchair ramp, for example, or things like that, like that is a reality that the narrative can or shouldn't be able to overcome, in a sense. And I don't think that holds just for institutions in a sense, which I think it makes a lot, and I mean, a lot of people do really important work to kind of like decompose the narratives of institutions, or look how institutions position themselves in discourse, but also in terms of personal actual lived experience. And so I'm kind of interested if there's more of a, and I mean, I don't know, because obviously I haven't read ahead, which would be crazy, but like if there's like more of an, I don't know, like kind of an active take on narrative theory that kind of like would, in a sense, be less from the Coxeye perspective of language and representation, and more from kind of like the material, maybe even like Derrida kind of type of reading of what like language, how language is also material and things like that. So that was kind of my point, and I'll be quiet again.
Just to follow on from that thinking a little bit as well. I mean, there's also a kind of, there's maybe a bit of a hierarchy at times, especially if we're thinking about the art context, about which of these narratives sort of hold more value, which traditionally has been the diachronic, this sort of ability to tell a kind of narrative of an art history of a place, for example, which when talking about it materially requires kind of an archive that has been supported and care of and has some kind of continuity in order to tell those stories, right? And so in places where that's not possible, and this is something that Alejandra is working on, right, with this question of humidity and archives and collections in the tropics, like if you don't have the capacity to sustain the material culture that then supports these diachronic tellings, you come up against these some of these same realities that you're talking about, Jesse. So yeah, I totally agree with that point of view.
Other comments, or I mean, there is. Yeah, who's that?
Oh, I just want to make sure I'm on the same page as Jesse when he talks about the criticisms of like the cognizant or representationalists, or the people who are thinking too much in terms of like language. Is in the Bruner piece, and I'm just going to read a quote here. He says, Grima's view is that a primitive or irreducible feature of story is that it occurs jointly on the plane of action and in the subjectivity of the protagonist. So saying that they're saying that there's these two different kind of features, that it occurs both on a plane of action and in the subjectivity of the protagonist, as if the subjectivity of the protagonist wasn't itself a plane of action. Maybe what you're wondering is if we're going to see an enactivist kind of framework that considers the subjectivities to be themselves planes of action. Is that along the same lines, Jesse, as what you were thinking of?
Yeah. I think so. Very much so. I mean, I think. Hello again. I think very much so. So in terms of that, there's actually, so there's not just these two planes or these two neat axes that kind of like exist, but there's a whole like processual kind of like becoming two subjectivities that constantly needs to either be reaffirmed or checked or retold in a sense, but not in the sense that there's one great one that we need to keep retelling ourselves, but rather that this is kind of like more like situated and contingent and dependent on the kind of, I guess, the norms of or the narrative norms that we can enact, like in terms of a general. I guess that's kind of, yeah. I think that's very much what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Okay.
There's nothing like that on the reading list. It's also because each session kind of has a theme, and so like we're moving basically through themes, and in each theme we only cover a certain amount of readings. So the selfhood theme is basically already like crammed into this week kind of thing. So and after it's more about these social things. I'm even not sure that I know of something that would like, I mean, yeah, there's certainly some connection between like embodied cognition ideas and narrative, but I have nothing that comes to mind immediately. I think, I mean, but with research, I'm sure something could come up. So yeah, so there's nothing that goes in that direction. But on the other hand, I wouldn't ever think of narratology or these approaches as something that should be like the unique thing which you would address an institution, or like where you would think, okay, like with narrative, I'm gonna understand the whole thing. I mean, I would always think that it's just one aspect of the things that are relevant. And so I wouldn't necessarily see it as incompatible with a reading that would take like this division between diachronic and episodic to read like how institutions go about creating programming, or how they tell their own story as an institution. And also still looking at this question of material context, of accessibility, of limits of accessibility, and so on. So I wouldn't necessarily like pose these two things as like either or. Maybe I'm wrong.
I have a question. Is there anything out there that like is looking at cognitive erasure or cognitive enhancement? And like, so cognitive erasure, I would think more about like Alzheimer's, for example, and with the enhancement, like, you know, there was a class that I was taking where we were speaking about like citation practices and how sort of like trying to cite somebody who might have some disease where it's linked to cognitive erasure versus cognitive enhancement, be it like schizophrenia or autism in some cases, might be something that that the academy would seem to think that is okay. And like, so I'm just wondering about like, are there any like people writing about this particular thing in terms of like narrative? Yeah.
I have a sense that I've seen some papers on Alzheimer and narrative, but I would have to like go into search again. I don't have it, like I didn't read them in order to be able to tell you. But if you look, I think if you look into the key terms, you'll definitely find something in terms of Alzheimer and narratology. But yeah, of course, I mean, yeah, but I don't have anything that I can like just hand out right now. Yeah, this question of multiplying, of course, also of narratives, I also found pretty interesting. It came up several times as well. The idea of this idea of multiple narratives of the self existing and this leading to different selves. I mean, if we go back to one of the basic questions of the text was whether the self is really constituted by narrative or if there's something else that constitutes the substance of the self. So different position being, of course, that not the self is constituted by narrative, but that our relationship to the self is constituted by narratives, which would be a weaker position than to say that the self is made of narrative, kind of. So our relationship would be modulated through narratives. And then the question of what happens if you have like, it was in the text, I think, by Shechtman, right? This idea of multiple personas or schizophrenia, that like you act differently because you have a different narrative as well, and you see yourself as being part of a different narrative. On the one hand, something that would be out of your hand, and then on the other, this idea that you could shift perspectives between the narrator who kind of creates the story, the character who kind of has to live the story and to whom things happen, like the Hiob character in the Bible, who kind of all kinds of stuff happens to him because someone else makes them happen, in this case, God. And then the precision of critic, where you kind of look back at the things that have happened. Did you find this distinction interesting or insightful, or is there something that's missing? Or is there some totally other point you want to speak about? Which is, of course, also still possible. Right.
Well, again, I think so. I just kind of calling back to some of the earlier classes that I think some of the people here have shared from this year is I like how that idea of, or the distinction of roles of character, narrator, author, and critic kind of line up nicely with kind of what I'm starting to see as a spectrum. So this artistic spectrum ranging from author through auteur as kind of a collaborative co-creator to curator. So thinking of a spectrum of a creative self, moving from author, the individual pure owner of a narrative, right, or of a self, to auteur, which is kind of the co-creation, right, which is like maybe setting the story world, but opening up the input of the external through society or institutions or tradition, and then again moving to the curator, right, which is a a final editing or critique or a collection of what could be considered valid or canonical experiences towards the overall, the thing, whatever that is, whether it's a self or a person or a collection, right? So I think for me, drawing that correlation is kind of valuable, and like I said, the idea of the self as a transmedia story world or whatever is kind of, like you said, kind of opens up a lot, and just kind of thinking about how we can, conceptualize self as, conceptualizing the self as a gallery that's curated by the self, right? This experiences and the memories and language and all of that being something that on multiple levels we are both, or we are all, the author, the editor, the audience, and the critic, right? And the curator. So anyway, it's kind of riffing, but
cool. Yeah, I mean, that's also something in your kind of narrative before. It was found interesting, this idea that we have this transmedia storytelling going on with all the actual media. So because then again we're in more classical vision of narrate. I mean, it's not like this idea that ourself, as in our relationship to ourselves, is fundamentally constituted by narratives, but that we kind of create a narrative out there through our CV and how these narratives are different. I think it's really it could be very interesting to think, to kind of connect narratology as a discipline that reads explicit narratives out there to narrative theory as interested in the self. I mean, through these kind of social media platforms and so on, and the narratives we have as an artist, or the mini bios we write, or the CVs and all that, would be an interesting place to connect both, I think. Again, which have at least partially developed very independently, so it's not like the same people doing that, and so on and so forth. So these connections are not often explored. Another aspect was, is there anyone? I'm always trying to look if someone wants to speak, but I'm not supposed to put you on the, here, Ellen, yes. Please. Wait, you're still on mute, sorry. Yeah, can you mute yourself? Wait. No, we can't hear you, wait. This, I always, I'll take you back to the, okay, no, I should be, yeah. Yes, there you go. No, you're still, right? Can anyone else hear? No. Now you're not muted, but we can't hear you. Maybe your microphone, maybe unplug totally your microphone, maybe use the microphone from the computer if that's, yeah, now we hear something.
No.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it was just to pick up on, I think, well, what Kid originally said about the curated self, and then when you were touching upon it with the social media platforms, and how I feel like now with the rise of the social media platforms and people that have the ability almost to edit their online selves, and then this kind of form of editing and the form of how people choose to present themselves across multiple platforms depending on how people wish to do so. I don't know, it kind of reminded me about Benjamin's storytelling and the loss of oral storytelling, because now with this kind of almost technological shield that the internet and everything provides, people have the ability to write stuff down or to edit themselves and time to do that and to present themselves how they want to be seen. And I don't know, it just made me think about that, and how that people can use these different platforms to curate themselves and have more time to think about it. rather than necessarily the oral way of telling stories or presenting oneself. So.
I don't know. I also think about like just specifically like in the art world and how it just, I don't know, it almost feels sometimes like it's just pushing you to do that, to just like create this self. Like I'm doing my MFA at Columbia, and we have these studio visits, like one up to the other, like each week. And like, I feel sometimes like it's just one huge performance of just saying, this is what I'm about, this is what my art's about. And, you know, and I'm just like, I don't even know that like you necessarily like seeing that in the work itself, you know, but it's almost like there's certain professions that are almost pushing for this sort of like performative nature of what it is that you do.
You're muted again.
You're muted.
Okay, sorry. So it's not only an opportunity to have these social media platforms, but it's also something that can be a weight or something, like that you're supposed to do it. Because like Ellen, the way I saw it was more that you see the opportunity in it. That you kind of see it as an opportunity to like take charge of your narrative, but then
Sorry.
Yeah.
Are you asking me?
No, I think like between the two, like that you're saying that it becomes a kind of pressure to do that, and that like you have to, maybe that because you have to narrate your practice, you kind of also denaturate it in a certain. It also, there's a risk of like narrowing it down so it can be neatly communicated in a studio visit. Whereas actually you might not even be ready to narrate it yet or something like and in the way Ellen like positioned it, it was also more this opportunity of taking charge of your narrative rather than like, you know, this idea, things that you want to say rather than things that other things want to say about you. Is that right, or am I getting these two?
I think following up on what Kelly was saying, I mean, I ran a music label, electronic music label for a while, and I think there's an interesting phenomenon that happens in music that may not carry over directly, or it's more multiple in nature than what happens, I think, with a general maybe a visual artist, right? So I think. As a visual artist or as a writer, or you kind of have to build this persona, which is the public version of yourself, right? You build this story about your art and your art practice that is supposed to direct the attention in a specific way, right? It's supposed to inform the experience, right? Within music, and specifically with electronic music, where the projected persona can be almost project based, right? So you have you have an artist with an artist persona and a name, and they have a style, and there's a presentation that's all about how they are delivering this specific type of music. Let's say they're doing trance, right? And so they will create this whole persona around who they are as a trance producer, right? But then maybe they also do electronica stuff under a different name. So you have the same person behind, the same artist behind multiple personas presenting themselves in a very different way. And so it's a very interesting thing to again, kind of correlate with the multiplicity of selves, right? And your ability to kind of segment parts of your personality or parts of your narrative into certain ways. That's kind of interesting, and kind of, I think, puts a magnifying glass on that I think what Kelly was saying about that kind of need or that push to define a clearly defined, simple, easy, digestible narrative version of the self that can be your elevator pitch or your studio visit, right?
Mm-hmm. And like even beyond the studio visit, I think it's like happens a lot just in the visual art world, right? It's like you definitely have to have that, like, you know, even just thinking about the artist statement or the bio, and it's just sort of like, what do you succinctly do? Like, what are your, you know, what do you think about, or in 500 words, you know,
right.
Which is interesting. And I don't know that carries over in other professions.
I'm afraid it might carry over to many. I mean, because even when you go on LinkedIn, where, you know, when you look at like what business people post, they also like seem to be constructing their personas, like posting stories and so on and so forth. So maybe it's more a phenomenon of our time as well, like this exposure, this like need for exposure kind of thing. But it's a good point, because like, yeah, Susie?
Yeah, there's something in Strawson's text where he talks about this, where he describes the diachronic person, again, as if it's a singular person, who are always sort of retelling their story of who they are, their narrative, right, of their self. And this idea that every time you retell something, you kind of lose something, or you're basically retelling the last version of the story that you told, and so every time you're doing this retelling of yourself, you're actually getting further away from who you really are. Is one of his kind of criticisms of the idea of the diachronic self. Just seems related to what Kelly was saying.
And I think sometimes you can also make like some kind of like performance of it, you know, like it's not all pessimistic, like not for me anyway. It's just sort of like, sometimes I kind of enjoy just like the retelling and telling, and like, you know, somebody will come in and say, oh no, but I see this, and I'm like, sure, okay, and I'll use that in the next round of people who are, you know, like, I think that there's also some agency in all of it. It's not,
that's right.
Yeah.
Good point. Other comments? There was one thing about this episodic thing that I kind of realized lately. I have a good friend who has extremely good memory, and I have very bad memory. So he knows about events of my life that I don't know about anymore. And it's kind of weird. And I think that like this idea of being episodic or diachronic, it's not like totally absurd. And it also is linked on how much you remember of your past. And if like you remember the events of your life very well, because of course, I mean, if you remember having spent this Christmas with a certain person, with a friend, say, and they don't remember, your relationship to them is very different than their relationship to you, for instance. So I think memory actually also plays really a key role in how we kind of, define ourselves, and others can really become co-creators of. I mean, that's something we didn't talk much about, but that you're not like the only author of your narrative. And you know how in couples, especially in breakups, people always fight about the narrative. Like who was the person who was disappointing, who actually, like, your partner tries to tell you who you are, like what's the right story about this breakup, and you fight back, and then you negotiate the two stories, and you have a feeling that if the wrong story wins, then you're not going to live on as the same person. Kind of. So it's not that,
That makes me think about the idea, well, technology in relation to memory, in the sense that, I mean, most explicitly the thing being like, well, or Facebook or something. Oh, I don't remember I don't keep in my memory some of my closest friends' birthdays because my Facebook does that for me, or certain factoids that I don't actually keep handy in my own brain because I can go into my phone and search them up. So this idea of like, a technologically mediated self, the fact that we're constituted by our phones, or that, it's a stretch to say that constitutes our self or our narrative, but certainly it's like a component of our memory at the very least.
It's true. I mean, we outsource part of the memory. But that's kind of, I mean, that there seems to be some potential for like artistic exploration of that as well. Like if you don't remember something and then you rediscover it and it becomes part of your narrative. I mean, because you have externalized it, because you have videotaped it. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of, I think, already stories that toy with that, like Memento or something, where people rely on an external memory and then they're like, oh, that's actually what happened, and so that's who I am, and and then how it becomes, it goes wrong sometimes. So, but yeah, definitely that's kind of also, that's something that we should bring in when we think about memory, I think, like in 2019. Like definitely that memory is not just in your head anymore, and that you can sometimes prove someone wrong by showing them messages or by showing them pictures, or so like that. So much is like, yeah, not totally in our minds anymore. We're officially at the end of this session. I hope you enjoyed it, and is there a last word that someone wants to say?
Are the presentations for next week already scheduled? I missed the end of the. I watched it, so I
Okay.
wasn't here for.
Okay. Yeah. So it would be great if maybe you don't have a presentation yet.
No.
You took one for next week. Yeah, definitely.
Is somebody already presenting on the capitalism one?
Actually, Kelly was going to present on it, okay, but she has a studio visit coming up. Is that right? So he could take it over. Is that okay? I mean, we then said, because the capitalism text goes through two sessions, so maybe you can take one of them and Kelly can take the other one, because then she can, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, which one would you? I'll sort it. Let's sort it out. Maybe not everybody needs to necessarily stay for that, but I'll send it to you guys, or we'll do it by email. Okay, Brian and Kelly, if that's okay. And who would be the respondent for Brian on?
I will.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, thanks again. Have a nice end of the week. Very end of the week. And see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Bye-bye.